In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 things you really need to avoid if you have depersonalization. But once you learn to eliminate these things or to reduce them, you will see it will greatly speed up your recovery process. Hi, and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So in the video I did on depersonalization, I realized that I focused a lot on the things that I did to recover. But what I didn't really focus too much on is the things that I cut out and that I avoid as much as possible, because these things ultimately were contributing to the symptoms of depersonalization. And so the first big one is just bad sleep habits, or getting consistently bad sleep. So for people who don't have depersonalization, we all know that sleep is something that if you don't get right, it impacts so much of what we do. I'd even argue it impacts pretty much everything that we do. But for someone who has depersonalization, the effects, from my experience, are so much more severe, because you can imagine that when you don't get enough sleep, of course, our brains don't feel like they can really function properly. We just generally feel like we've got brain fog. Things can seem like things become more difficult. It becomes harder to concentrate, harder to remember things, and we can feel just a bit out of it. And yet that's a normal experience for someone who has depersonalization symptoms, depending on the severity. So not getting the right kind of sleep just makes all these things much, much worse. And the big thing it does is it simply increases the feeling of unsafety within themselves and within reality, because it creates the feeling that of losing control, not being able to handle situations that come up. And so when I say bad sleep, what I'm really referring to is either not getting enough sleep or getting too much, because both can be as bad as each other. So really there's a sweet spot of not just how much sleep everyone will have, that's a little differently, but there's an exact time as well, an ideal time to go to sleep, an ideal time to wake up. And this is all to do with our circadian rhythm. So this is our body's internal biological clock. And for example, when part of our brain picks up that there is light, for example, sunlight, then it's learned over time, well, this means it's morning. And when there's darkness, it's learned, okay, this is evening, this time to sleep. But it's done this for so long that it knows when the time to sleep is, when the time to wake up is, and knows when to introduce those chemicals for waking and sleeping, like cortisol and melatonin. And so what you really want to do is to work with your body's cycle, work with nature. And so your circadian rhythm throughout the day will introduce certain chemicals and do certain things. So your body has its own schedule. So you want to be in line with your body's schedule. So there's an ideal time to sleep. So I will do a video on sleep itself, but I myself now have to get back my sleep cycle to what it used to be. So once I've got that back, I will be able to make that video, which will show you how to get really good sleep. The next thing you want to eliminate or reduce as much as possible is overstimulation through dopamine. So I mentioned this a bit in my video on mobile phones and also video game addiction. But essentially, dopamine is the pleasure or reward chemical in our brain. So when we've done something, we've achieved something, then that feeling of achievement and pleasure comes into our brain, which is from dopamine. So the problem we have nowadays is that the digital apps or digital software, digital things we have in our lives, like video games, for example, or the endless supply of entertainment we have through all kinds of ways, this has kind of messed up our dopamine receptors, because we can now get instant gratification when we want, and that gratification is most often from dopamine. But our dopamine receptors, which are where the dopamine comes from, are not meant to actually be constantly stimulated. Because if you constantly get a reward, it's not really rewarding in the end, is it? It's just an obvious thing you get all the time. On a psychological level, that is. But on a neurological level, there is going to be a limit to how much the receptors can handle. So if you imagine, for example, let's say somebody, I'm sure everyone knows somebody like this. Let's say there's someone who can only have spicy food, and they can only eat food if it's a certain amount of heat in the spiciness. What I suggest has happened is that they for so long consume so much spicy food that they need now increasing amounts of spice and increasing amounts of heat from the spice to be able to get a sensation of taste. Don't quote me on that, just an observation. I don't think there's a scientific study on this. So you could say that their taste buds are overstimulated because now when they eat other foods, they can't really taste it. So this also happens with overstimulation in our brains, where because we've received such a high amount of dopamine rewards, we need greater and greater amounts of video games or social media or TV, for example, or other things to get that sense of reward. The problem then, and this also can come from things like music, or sugar is a big thing as well. It will depend on the person, but sugar actually does trigger dopamine, which is kind of surprising, but it's like seen as a reward, so that's why it can be so addictive. The connection between this and depersonalization is when you have depersonalization, there is a general feeling of numbness and detachment, and often that can mean you don't feel like there's a point to anything, and you could partly because you can't feel the rewards or good feelings. And I think a large part of this, at least for me it was probably the overstimulation through things like video games meant that I biologically, neurologically was not able to really get that sensation of a reward or pleasure because I'd overstimulated the dopamine receptors. So only once I started cutting a lot of these things out, then basic things started to become more pleasurable again, like, going for a nice walk in the sun, that kind of thing. All of a sudden, little things could now become pleasurable again. The next thing you want to cut out as much as possible, which does sound obvious at first, but it's almost like it's almost hidden in plain sight, are toxic relationships and unhealthy dynamics. So I've mentioned this quite a bit in the video on depersonalization, but it's not just about, I'm not talking about, let's say, toxic relationship where they're actually I'm not just talking about toxic relationships where there's like two people in a relation, in like an intimate relationship. I can mean just dynamics within friends, within co-workers, within family as well, where things are generally normal, but there could be one or two aspects of the relationship that are toxic. And the toxic aspect of this could be that there aren't healthy boundaries set. So let's say, for example, someone's boundaries, emotional boundaries, keep being violated. Then this isn't going to create a feeling of safety for someone who has depersonalization. So if you find, for example, that you're in certain groups or certain relationships and there are some aspects of it that never make you feel good or safe, and you do notice it does trigger depersonalization, then you have to set some kind of boundary there, because it's actually fueling that feeling of unsafety in relationships, which is what ultimately is fueling depersonalization. And the next thing you have to cut out, and I think this is another hidden one, is a bad diet. Now, obviously, this is an obvious thing to cut out for anyone in general, but the reason why I believe it affects depersonalization symptoms quite a bit is because if you want your body to feel safe, then it needs its needs met. So our bodies have nutritional needs, and these are not really negotiable needs because your body has a requirement of resources in terms of vitamins and minerals, for example, and phytonutrients that will help it as well. So if your body is lacking in certain nutrients or has deficiencies, apart from the fact that you'll get physical symptoms in some ways, but sometimes these can come out as feeling weak, for example, or having difficulty sleeping, or it can be just a feeling of uneasiness. These can be attributed to symptoms from depersonalization, or we can think that to do with other things like anxiety and depression. But they can be actually purely from our bodies, from nutritional needs not being met. So once I started to change my diet to mostly focus on nutritional needs, I did notice symptoms that I initially thought were related to anxiety were actually they just went away. And so I came to realize that often we can think that things are related to psychological symptoms when they can be sometimes a root of it can be from our diet and from what it's not getting. This also links into the gut bacteria. So I am still learning about this, but essentially there is a link between the gut flora, so the ecosystem of bacteria in our gut, and there's a connection to that, to our brain as well. And so once I did start focusing on probiotics and having foods that have healthy bacteria in them, again, I noticed another improvement where things that I initially thought were connected to depersonalization, well, they went away. So again, that's something to look into, and I will do another video on that once I've learned more about it. And also blood sugar levels. I found, so have you ever had the experience where you've eaten breakfast and shortly afterwards, a few hours later, you're hungry again and feeling tired and weak, or you had lunch, and then a few hours later, shortly after, you're feeling tired and weak again. So I noticed that was happening to me, and I thought, that makes no sense. Why is it I'm eating food but then feeling tired and hungry again afterwards? Surely I've fueled my body, I should feel the opposite. But of course, it was not just related to what I was eating, but when I was eating as well. So this is related to something, again, I'm learning more about, so I will go into this further once I learn more, but the gist of it is it's related to blood sugars. So this is also related to eating a high carbohydrate diet. So I eliminated, so far from my diet, things like bread, pasta, biscuits, cookies, anything that basically has high refined carbohydrates. I also eliminated things like rice as well, grains as much as possible. So the only carbohydrates I really focused on were from fruit and vegetables. But even with fruits, I limited it to an extent because ultimately those convert into sugars. And so the relationship with that is sugar. So yes, there is sugar you get in terms of refined sugar, like the actual white powder. But the other sugars that are hidden are when we consume high amounts of carbohydrates, our bodies are going to convert it into sugar, like glucose, for example. So when we consume high amounts of sugar, our blood sugar levels go up, and it's not supposed to go up too high. So the body will produce chemicals like hormones, like insulin, for example, that will force our blood sugar levels to go back down. So the problem is that if it goes too high, eventually it will crash down. I think there is a term called a sugar crash, for example, where if you eat too much sugar, you get that high for a bit and then it just crashes down and you feel really bad afterwards. And it seems to be because when your blood sugar levels are too low, then that's the feeling you get of feeling weak. And then this can often lead to the craving for more sugar or more carbohydrates, because it's a quick way for your body to get it back up again, but it's not the healthiest way. And over time, this creates other problems like insulin resistance, weight gain, and a whole bunch of other stuff, which once I learn more about it, I'll do a video on as well. But the connection between this and depersonalization, and I suspect other mental health problems, is if you're constantly feeling okay and then weak, okay and then weak throughout the day, that again can seem like it's from depersonalization or other psychological issues, when it's biological. But also on a deeper level, it doesn't add to the feeling of safety. It feels like you're losing control. If it keeps happening for years, this creates an unconscious experience that, oh, well, I can't feel good. But once I changed this, and I'm still working on this, I definitely have noticed a difference. And then finally, this is a really big one, is obsessing over the symptoms. Now, this is like probably one of the hardest ones to do, especially when you initially first have depersonalization, because it's kind of hard to not obsess with them because they're in your face, they're constantly creating all these problems. But the main thing that you need to do is to accept the experience as it is, because in accepting it, then we let go of the fear of it, because fearing is ultimately trying to move away from it. By accepting it, you're letting it be. And this is important because if we get into that cycle of seeing the symptoms, experiencing them, being scared of them, then the fear of the symptoms generates anxiety, which just generates more symptoms. So by accepting it, you're stopping that loop. And yeah, of course, so if you're focused too much on the symptoms and obsessed over it, then you're not actually going to be able to focus on the solutions. So the difference is that if you're obsessing with the symptoms, obsession is not learning. So obsessing is going over the same things you already know, hoping that there will be a change. But learning is when you've gone over what you're experiencing, you've gone over the symptoms, and you're taking the lessons from that so you can work towards solutions. So that's the difference between learning and obsessing. But I understand when you're first experiencing depersonalization, it's very difficult to not obsess over it. But as with anything, with practice, you can learn it. And I know some of these things seem kind of obvious, but it's not as straightforward. It can take practice, because let's say somebody wants to change their sleep and they want to improve it, but maybe they can't get good sleep because they're having issues not being able to stop obsessing over the symptoms. That will make it hard to sleep. Maybe they have some diet issues, like if you have magnesium deficiency, that can affect your sleep, for example. Toxic relationships can lead to the need to, let's say, escape with digital things, which can often then affect sleep. So there is a pattern that can emerge. So it's about finding out what you can eliminate bit by bit, and gradually it'll start to get a lot easier to eliminate the other ones. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.